For over 300,000 years, Neanderthals owned Europe. They survived ice ages that would have killed us. They hunted mammoths in frozen valleys, buried their dead with flowers, and built fires in caves that still hold their soot today. Then, around 45,000 years ago, a new species walked into their territory, smaller, thinner, physically weaker in almost every way. Within 5,000 years, the Neanderthals were gone. But here's the strange part. They didn't just disappear. Before they vanished, the two species lived side by side. They shared the same valleys, the same hunting grounds, the same caves. And according to the DNA inside your body right now, they did a lot more than just coexist. So what really happened when Neanderthals met us? Was it war? Was it love? Or was it something stranger than either? To understand what happened when these two species collided, you first need to understand just how different they were. Neanderthals were built like tanks. Stocky, barrel-chested with bones so dense that a Neanderthal arm bone weighs roughly twice as much as yours. Their skulls had massive brow ridges and a brain that was on average slightly larger than ours, about 1,600 cubic centimeters compared to our 1,400. They were cold weather specialists. Their bodies had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to survive the brutal Ice Age conditions of Europe and Western Asia. Short limbs to conserve heat, enormous nasal passages to warm freezing air before it hit their lungs. Homo sapiens, on the other hand, came from a completely different world. We evolved in the open grasslands and coastlines of Africa, taller, leaner, built for endurance rather than brute strength. Our advantage wasn't physical, it was social. We moved in larger groups, we developed more complex language, and we made one type of tool that Neanderthals, despite their intelligence, never seemed to master: symbolic objects, art, ornaments, things with no survival function at all, things that only matter if you're communicating identity and meaning to a wide social network. For a long time, researchers assumed the meeting between these two species was simple. Smarter humans arrive, outcompete the primitive Neanderthals, end of story. That narrative is falling apart, and the evidence that's replacing it is far more complicated and far more interesting. The first contact probably didn't happen in Europe at all. Genetic and archaeological evidence points to the Levant, the region around modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, as one of the earliest meeting points. At two caves just a few hundred meters apart on Mount Carmel in Israel, archaeologists found something remarkable. The cave of Eskul contained Homo sapiens fossils dating to around 120,000 years ago, and the nearby cave of Tabun held Neanderthal remains from a similar period. Two different species living in nearly the same spot, separated by what might have been just a few generations. But this early encounter didn't last. That first wave of Homo sapiens into the Levant seems to have retreated or died out. The Neanderthals held their ground. It would take another 70,000 years before our species pushed into Europe for good. When it finally happened, the overlap period was surprisingly long. At sites across Europe, we can see evidence that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens shared the same regions for anywhere from 2,600 to over 5,000 years. That's not a quick invasion. That's generations upon generations living in proximity. And the archaeological record from this overlap period tells a story nobody expected. At a site called Grotte du Renne in Arcy-sur-Cure, France, archaeologists found Neanderthal remains associated with something unusual: bone tools, pendants made from animal teeth, and body ornaments. These are the kinds of symbolic objects that were supposed to be exclusively human. Either Neanderthals invented these independently, or they learned to make them from the new neighbors who had just moved into the valley next door. And that possibility, that Neanderthals were watching us and learning from us, changes the entire picture of what this encounter looked like. In 2010, a team led by geneticist Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig published a finding that rewrote human history. They sequenced the Neanderthal genome, and buried inside the data was something nobody could argue with. Between 1 and 4% of the DNA in every living person of non-African descent comes directly from Neanderthals. That means interbreeding, not once, not as some freak accident, but repeatedly across thousands of years in multiple locations. The implications are staggering. These weren't just two species tolerating each other from a distance. They were forming bonds close enough to produce children, and those children survived and had children of their own, all the way down to you. In 2015, researchers analyzed the jawbone of a Homo sapiens found in the Peștera cu Oas cave in Romania. It dated to around 40,000 years ago, and the DNA told a remarkable story. This individual had a Neanderthal ancestor just 4 to 6 generations back. That's a Neanderthal great-great-great-grandparent. Not ancient history, family history. But the interaction wasn't just genetic. There's growing evidence that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens exchanged knowledge. At several sites in southern France and northern Spain, archaeologists have identified a transitional tool culture called the Châtel-Perronian. It blends Neanderthal tool-making techniques with innovations that look distinctly like Homo sapiens technology. Some researchers interpret this as direct evidence of cultural transmission. Neanderthals watching, learning, and adapting techniques from the newcomers. Others push back. They argue Neanderthals could have developed these innovations independently. The debate is ongoing, and neither side has a knockout argument yet. But there's one more piece of evidence that's hard to dismiss. At sites across Europe, Neanderthals were making eagle talon jewelry and using pigments like manganese dioxide long before Homo sapiens arrived on the continent. At Krapina in Croatia, eagle talon pendants have been dated to around 130,000 years ago. They weren't the brainless brutes of old textbooks. They were thinking, creating, and expressing themselves in ways we're only beginning to understand. So if they were this capable, this adaptable, this intelligent, the real question becomes even harder to answer. Why did they disappear? Around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthal populations started collapsing. Within a few thousand years, they were gone everywhere except a handful of refugia in southern Iberia and possibly the edges of the Caucasus. The old explanation was simple. We killed them. Homo sapiens arrived, fought for resources, and won. But the evidence for large-scale violence between the two species is almost non-existent. There are no Neanderthal massacre sites, no battlefields, no mass graves filled with spear wounds. The reality appears to have been slower and in some ways, sadder. Neanderthals lived in small, isolated groups. Genetic evidence shows they had extremely low genetic diversity, which tells us their populations were fragmented. Small bands scattered across huge territories, rarely meeting each other. Homo sapiens, by contrast, maintained larger social networks. More people meant more ideas, more specialization, more resilience to local disasters. When a bad winter wiped out a Neanderthal band of 15, that was a catastrophe. When it hit a sapiens network of 150, it was a setback. Over centuries, this difference in social structure created a slow, grinding demographic pressure, not a war, not a genocide, something more like a tide. At Gorham's Cave on the southern tip of Gibraltar, researchers found what may be one of the last Neanderthal sites in existence. The charcoal deposits suggest small groups were still lighting fires here around 40,000 years ago, possibly later. Imagine that for a second. A small band of Neanderthals on a rocky cliff at the edge of the continent, the ocean stretching out before them. Behind them, a landmass that their ancestors had ruled for hundreds of thousands of years, now populated by a different species entirely. They weren't conquered, they were absorbed. Some interbred with Homo sapiens and their genes passed into our lineage. Others simply couldn't sustain their small, isolated populations against a competitor that was more socially connected. Climate played a role too. The period between 45,000 and 40,000 years ago saw wild swings in European climate. Rapid cold snaps followed by warming periods. Neanderthals had survived ice ages before, but this time they were dealing with environmental chaos and a new competitor simultaneously. It was the combination that did it. No single factor was enough on its own. But together, the demographic pressure, the climate instability, the slow absorption through interbreeding, it was more than any species could withstand. Here's what makes this story so strange. The Neanderthals disappeared as a species, but they never really went extinct. Their DNA is inside billions of people alive today. Genes that affect your immune system, your skin, your hair, even your sleep patterns can be traced back to Neanderthal ancestors who lived 50,000 years ago. In a very real, biological sense, the meeting between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens never ended. It's still playing out inside your cells right now. And every year, new discoveries push the story further. In 2022, Svante Pääbo won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his work on ancient DNA. The field he essentially created is still young, and the caves of Europe, Asia, and the Levant are still giving up secrets. We used to think the story of human evolution was a straight line. One species replaces another, better always wins. But the reality is messier, more tangled, and honestly, more fascinating. Two species met, they competed, they coexisted, they had children together, and then one of them faded away, leaving only traces in the bones of caves and the code of our DNA. The Neanderthals were not a dead end. They were a chapter in our own story, and we're still reading it. If you want to see how another ancient human species survived in ways we're only now uncovering, that video is on screen now. Subscribe if you want more stories from deep prehistory. There's a lot we still don't know. And that's exactly what makes it worth digging into.